Hello, everyone, and welcome. Welcome. You've joined Intentional Conversations VodCast, and we have been expecting you. We're so glad to have you here as part of our VodCast community. I do ask that you go to the chat, let us know where you are joining the conversation from. It's always a treat for us to know where people are joining the conversation from, and we know that we have folks from all over, even in some global markets. And so we're always so grateful for those who join us for this hour of time to learn with and from each other. I also want to let you know that we have closed caption that's available for those who need it. This is our way at NWC, standing in solidarity with disability inclusion. And so I want to make sure that you are aware that that is available for you if it's needed. I am Dr. Nika White, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm so glad to be here today serving as your host of this podcast. I also want to shout out the NWC team who works so hard every single week to ensure that we can bring a quality virtual production experience to each of you. And so I could not do this without them, and I'm so grateful for their support. Today, cameras are not at all required, but they are encouraged. We love to see smiling faces. And so if you are willing to have those cameras on, we really do appreciate that. It just helps us to get proximate to each other, again, as we are really trying to establish community with this VodCast audience. I'm also grateful for those who have joined via LinkedIn Live. And so if that's the mode in which you have joined the VodCast today, welcome. I will let you know that if you want to optimize your experience, we do believe that being a part of the Zoom community for this podcast is ideal. And so my team will place the link for you to be able to switch over and join us on Zoom if that's your preference. But I always like to socialize that just in case. 30 minutes after the hour, we will stop letting people into our VodCast. That is just for extra safety precautions of this community and this space. And so I always like to mention that in advance. And today we do encourage you to use the chat. Let us know what's coming up for you, what sentiments you're holding in mind, what curiosities and questions. We're watching that chat. If there's some resources that come up and you feel it would be beneficial to this entire community, then we ask that you share it into the chat or into the comments on LinkedIn. And my team, again, is making sure we pull all of that information into this VodCast community. Once again, you've joined Intentional Conversations VodCast, where we intersect conversations of diversity, equity, and inclusion and leadership. And I am so glad you're here. So let the conversations begin. As the slide just said, once again, if you're just joining us, I'm Dr. Nika White. I am your host of Intentional Conversations VodCast, brought to you by NWC. And this is just our way of showing up for the broader community of people who really want to deepen their understanding, their knowledge, and be in community with others who have that same desire, as we really try to help do our part to foster greater inclusivity and equity into today's world. And so I'm so excited to have you here. As I normally do, I just want to share a couple thoughts that are top of mind for us at NWC as we enter into a new month. Welcome to August. And August is National Black Business Month. And I would be remiss as a Black woman who is a founder and a business owner to not celebrate and acknowledge and recognize all of the Black businesses who are really making an impact in terms of the economy, creating jobs, using entrepreneurship as a way to build wealth and to break maybe some generational curses. I think it's so important for us to amplify and support Black businesses. And so not only this month, but all throughout the year, please consider some Black businesses that you can support to make sure that we are protecting the full turf of Black businesses throughout the country. Now, I have been sharing with you for quite some time now, since the beginning of the year, in fact, about the release of book number 3 in partnership with Forbes Books, and that is Inclusion Uncomplicated, a Transformative Guide to Simplify DEI. Because so many of you are repeat attendees of this podcast, I wanted to share something that maybe I have not socialized with you about the book, Inclusion Uncomplicated. One of my favorite parts of the book is that every chapter ends with this graphic summary of all of the most salient points from each chapter. And I did that because I wanted people to have a quick snapshot of what they've learned as they're processing and going through some of the critical reflection exercise that also find their way at the end of every chapter. So if you haven't yet picked up your copy, it is available on Kindle right now for $1.99. You can't beat that. But if you're like me and you like to have a hard copy, you can order it from Amazon, or you can get it from anywhere you like to purchase your books. And I do welcome and always appreciate, and I'm grateful for Amazon reviews. And so if you haven't done that yet, I would certainly appreciate that. I've also been sharing with you that I released LinkedIn Learning course number 1. It's all about individual accountability for equity and inclusion, and I want to introduce you to that right now.
Hello, I'm Dr. Nika White. I firmly believe that at the heart of each journey is a first step taken by an individual. Creating equitable and inclusive workplaces, isn't that the work of the organizations? What does it have to do with you? Everything, every single thing. Organizations are made up of people, and this work always starts at the individual level. In this course, you will learn about the importance of individual accountability for equity and inclusion, irrespective of your organizational role, how you can equip yourself to take personal responsibility in this domain, and that's not all, concrete examples of what it looks like in practice. So when you are ready, join me. We're going to take that first step together. Let's get started.
One of the things that I am doing right now is I'm offering my course for free for the next 24 hours. And so I'm going to ask my teammates to please share into the chat the link to my LinkedIn Learning course. And I do encourage all of you to share that out, take advantage of that learning opportunity. And I would love to know what you think. Now, as we look forward to future weeks in this month of August, I want you to know what you have to look forward to in terms of our guest co-host. On August 11th, next Friday, I'm going to be welcoming Melissa Watson Ward, and her work with Emerge is going to be the topic of conversation. It is a political organization designed to help more women and non-binary leaders get into elected office, and how new American majority is not yet reflected in our elected officials. And so I hope you'll join me on the 11th. Following that, next Friday on the 18th, I have Dr. Stephanie M. Kirkland, and she has research that's entitled The Portrait of a Leader: How to Decenter Prototypical Leadership Norms and Normalize African-American Women's Leadership Modality in Dominant Cultural Organizations. And so join me for that riveting conversation. I know it's going to be rich, and I hope that you will be here to hear it all. And then also towards the end of August on the 25th, we have Julia Rock. And in that podcast, we're going to be talking about career transitions, development, navigation and advancement, as well as employee-employer relationships and networking. So if that sounds of interest to you, tell your friends, tell your coworkers, tell your associates, invite them to come and be a part of our podcast community for all of the weeks coming up in August. And we look forward to seeing you and them. Now, if you have been with us, you know that I always take a moment to read the bio of each of our guest co-hosts. This is important to me because even though some of you may already be familiar with our guest co-hosts, I like to make sure that we are centering the accolades, the credentials, the experience in which our guest co-hosts are showing up to our VodCast conversation. So this week will be no different. And I am so pleased to be able to welcome today Jaya Saxena, and I'm going to read her bio at this time. Jaya is a lawyer and diversity and inclusion strategist with almost 20 years of advocacy and professional development expertise. She currently serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Spencer Stuart, one of the world's leading global executive search and leadership consulting firms. Previously, she was the Director of DEI at the Brattle Group, a global economics advisory firm. She is recognized DEI leader with experience operating in the professional services sector in both the law firm White & Case and the consulting space Brattle. In these roles, she created the internal programming, systems, and infrastructure necessary to welcome, retain, and develop underrepresented talent. Her experiences in developing novel diversity programming within professional services organizations known for legacy habits and customs. As the most senior diversity leader at Brattle, Jaya spent the most recent chapter of her career implementing DEI strategy across Brattle's matrix structure while advising its C-suite on how to ensure the gains are sustainable and long-lasting. She brings an international lens to her work, having operated with the global scope while at White and Case, as well as Brattle. Jaya is active in the community, having served on numerous boards. She earned her JD from the University of North Carolina School of Law and graduate and undergraduate degrees from Carnegie Mellon University. Jaya also has an executive certificate in strategic diversity and inclusion management from Georgetown University and a graduate certificate in health and wellness coaching from the Maryland University of Integrative Health. She is a mom to two spirited and delightful young girls, 9 and 5. On the weekend, she enjoys mocktails and cocktails at her family bar, the Fountain Inn in Georgetown, DC. So I'm often in DC. I have to make sure that I check that out. So if you would, podcast community, you know what to do. Find those accolades, those words of affirmation. Let's let Jaya know how much we welcome her being here with us today. Whatever kind of emojis that feel appropriate, let's get those going into the chat. And I am just so excited. I always tell my guest co-hosts that you could be anywhere on a Friday at 11 Eastern Standard Time doing so many things, especially knowing how busy your schedule is, reading all that you're involved in. But the fact that you said yes to us means a lot to us, Jaya. And so we certainly want to make sure that we give you a chance to feel welcomed as we start our rich conversation that's going to ensue today. So I want to give you a chance to greet this audience in your own way. And so I will share, though, that one of the things we often like to hear from our guest co-hosts when they're starting out to share is something that we would not know about you from reading your bio or from looking at your LinkedIn profile. Welcome, Jaya.
Thank you so much. I am so thrilled to be here today. Thank you so much for the warm welcome and all of in the chat feature. So thank you so much, Dr. Nika, for your leadership, for your work in this space, and for the opportunity to be in conversation with you, and to all of you for joining. Really, really appreciate that. And I appreciate your kind introduction. I will share a bit more about myself personally, because it really is our background and our lived experiences that shape our approach to ourselves, others, and the world. And so I will start off by sharing that I am a cisgender woman and a member of the Asian diaspora, which is extremely diverse. Here in the United States, with at least 20 countries in East and Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent represented. More specifically, I am South Asian. I am the daughter of immigrant parents from India. As with many immigrant families, my parents left everything they knew back home to come here in the 1970s in search of a better life for my sister and I. I am a Gen Xer, raised with one sibling. In the DMV area. I know a number of you who joined us are from the DMV or are there right now. So from that area, as you mentioned, I'm the daughter or the mother of two daughters who are now 10 and 6. I am also a self-proclaimed ambivert with a mix of extrovert and introvert features. I don't think we talk enough about personality and how that shapes us in our experience in the workplace, although I'll probably say I have a tendency towards introversion. So that's, I guess, and I'll say this because I listened to another podcast the other day where the woman introduced herself by sharing that she's 50. I am 45. And when I heard her share her age, I said, wow, that is so lovely, because I don't think in this country we embrace age. So I, for the longest time, probably didn't share my age. And so I'm going to embrace this journey, this part of my life, and say that I am a Gen Xer at 45.
I love all of that. There's so many similarities. So we have to talk about the ambivert piece because I too classify myself as an ambivert, and I want this audience to understand what that is for those that may be hearing it for the first time or holding some curiosity. So let's make sure we circle back to that. And I love
Absolutely.
that you brought the age to the conversation. Why is it that we often are reluctant to share our age? And I have to say, I don't normally give my introductions with giving my age, but I'm feeling inspired today because of you, Jaya. So I am 47 and I am Dr. Nika White, and I am proud to be 47.
Absolutely.
Yes, Gen Xer as well here. So that is great. And I love the fact that you gave emphasis to your South Asian heritage. I think that's so critically important, and particularly the fact that that population is so vast, and we have to make sure we continue to educate around that. And that is part of one of the reasons we were really excited to have you on today, is to bring that perspective, that additional learning that can help us as we're building up our cultural intelligence and humility. And so thank you so much. So should we maybe just jump right into the ambivert first before we start thinking about
Sure.
something?
Absolutely.
Okay. So how
Absolutely.
does that impact you and your professional and your personal life? And how are you defining what an ambivert is?
Well, so most of you have probably heard about extroversion and introversion, and I think, and ambiverts, which is sort of less discussed, but I'll share about that in a minute. And I think there are a lot of perceptions and misperceptions about what it means to be an extrovert versus an introvert. I think there's
Yes.
a lot of stereotypes that if you're an introvert, you're a wallflower, you don't like to talk, you
Yeah.
don't have friends, you're antisocial. And that has nothing to do with it. It's truly about where you derive your source of energy from. And so extroverts tend to derive energy from people and their surroundings. And introverts tend to, after a long day, spending all day connecting and talking to people, sort of draw energy from within. And so it's really about where do you draw your source of energy from? And then ambiverts are sort of in between. They're leaning sort of both ways, which is how I think I am, but again, with tendencies towards introversion. And I think that it certainly impacts one's experience in the workplace because, quite frankly, I think our society has a positive bias towards extroversion. I think as a society, we tend to favor, even when we think about leadership and what that looks like, people who are very outspoken, vocal, talk a lot, even if not what they're saying always makes the most sense.
Yes.
I think there's a lot of power in quiet leadership. And those of you may have read the book Quiet by Susan Cain, really empowering people to own their ambiversion, introversion, extroversion. We need all of it in the workplace and in society. So that's just a little bit about how I sort of view it.
I so love that you brought this to the conversation because it's not something we talk about as often in this broad scope of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it very much is a dimension of diversity that I think is really important. I think it also helps us to really check our bias when we start to make judgments around someone that we are classifying as being an introvert or an extrovert, because you are right. I do agree. I think that a lot of times that extroversion way of showing up is something that people perceive as superior to being introvert. And like you, I love the language of quiet leadership. I think that being slow to speak, being very thoughtful is just as important as someone who is just ready to chime in every single time, right, without really that introspection. So I do want to place into the chat, you mentioned a resource. So we love resources here at the Intentional Conversations VodCast, but you mentioned Quiet by Susan Cain. So if someone on my team could source that and place it into the chat for anyone that may be interested, I would love for us to all have value of considering that as an additional tool. I say that I'm an ambivert because I am very much in both camps. There are a lot of times where, surprisingly to a lot of people, I just want to be in a corner by myself, quiet, no TV, no background noise, nothing, just present with myself. I value those moments. I do. And when I particularly feel the need to have that time, is after I have done like a podcast, after I've done like a public speaking, engagement. My team can tell you I am usually like, I always prepare myself on the front end, because usually after a keynote, people, they're lined up. They want to talk with you. They want to meet with you. They want to engage with you. And that is great. But I have learned over the years that I can't have like too many of that going on in a given time period. I need to spread them out. I need to make sure that there's time for me to retreat and to recharge with just quiet. And so, some folks may not have known that about me, but that is very true. So I do classify as an ambivert. That was a fun conversation. Thanks for letting us go there.
I wanted to add one quick point.
Yes.
Nika. So thanks for sharing that about your background as well. And I would just note that there's an added layer of complexity, because we all have, I want to just tie this to intersectionality for a moment.
Yes, please do.
We can't talk about these aspects of our identity in silos. And so for me, it's a very interesting experience being an ambivert / introvert as a woman of color, as an Asian. Like, all of these layers of identity make it much more nuanced and complex in terms of my lived experience in society, but also in the workplace. And we'll talk that we'll probably talk about that a little bit later in terms of the model minority myth and how that plays into the experience of Asians, because one aspect of the model minority myth is Asians being very quiet and reserved. And so it's really interesting when you start to think about these issues from a lens of intersectionality as well.
No, I love that. And, I think that it's appropriate for us to go right there. So as you mentioned, yes, many Asians have been stereotyped, generalized as model minorities. And so I want us to unpack what that is. I don't want to assume that everybody showing up to this conversation has heard that before and they know what that means. But so I want you to talk about what that means, but also, has that stereotype had any effects on your personal life? And if so, how and how do you navigate it?
Great question. So let's first define what we mean by the model minority myth, right? So, and again, some of you may already be familiar with this term, but if you're not, it's essentially based on stereotypes, and it perpetuates a particular narrative about Asian Americans. For example, the idea that all Asian children are math whizzes or are musical geniuses, neither of which I have ever been. Or that Asians are polite and quiet and rule followers, who we keep our heads down, we get the work done. And I quite frankly think that has absolutely led to some people thinking that we have a higher level of success than others, when in reality, when you look at senior levels of leadership, Asians are not represented nearly as they are at lower levels. And there's a lot of research and writing. McKinsey does a ton of research around women in the workplace, but also the Asian experience in the workplace. And it's not only pervasive, but it's very problematic. And I think it's problematic for a number of reasons. One, it really erases the diversity within the Asian diaspora. It makes it seem like we are this one monolith of a community, as opposed to individuals with our own unique differences, and we should be valued and recognized and differentiated from one another. It perpetuates the myth of Asians being perpetual foreigners. And I have a very recent story around that if we have time, but this notion that we don't belong here, that we are foreigners, that we are othered. And I think another area where it's very problematic is it suggests that racism against Asian Americans doesn't exist. Because we are doing so well, in quotes, in spite of systemic inequities and discrimination. And we've all seen that post-COVID, with all of the anti-violence and hate, we've seen that that's certainly not the case. And then finally, the other thing that I think is really frustrating is it pits people of color against one another.
Yes.
And we could easily, it pits us against one another, which means we can't truly be liberated as a community of people of color, of underrepresented people. So I'll say that's sort of how I define it, Nika. And if you want, I can share how it's affected my professional life. I don't know if there's anything you want to sort of react to around that or add.
No, I really would love to keep you on the path of sharing, because you are really bringing forth some valid points that I think this community needs to be able to understand and have time to process. So please do go and share how this has impacted you professionally.
I think for me, it's most impacted me having to define my own leadership style and realize that there is no singular way to be a successful leader, and to appreciate all of my strengths and really redefine for me, what does leadership look like? There was a New York Times article, I think a few years ago, and it asked people sort of, how do you, if you had to paint a picture, draw a picture of a leader, who would come to mind? And of course, it was sort of a white, cis, heterosexual male who is outspoken, like all of these characteristics that are very much not me. I mean, you can see that when you look at me. And so I think I've had to really think about, and I am generally non-confrontational. I can be reserved. And I've really had to think about how can, instead of conforming to our dominant culture's standards of leadership, how can I become the leader that I want to be? I've worked very hard at, communicating clearly and competently, like all of these things, because, but in a way that is true to myself. So I think for me, the way this has impacted me the most is really needing to redefine what it means to be a successful leader. And what does that mean for me, given the way I present, the way I look, my identity, who I am, sort of living in that truest, most possible way, because I think then we can really be our best selves.
Yeah, that is so good. I don't know if I've ever been a part of a conversation where we were talking about different, stereotypes, and specifically like the model minority and how it has impacted someone's view of their leadership, and how to lean into a leadership model and style that best fit them. And I say that with great recognition that I think so many of us, when we think about leadership, we automatically gravitate to what many in society view as model leadership, which is the Eurocentric, the white-centered way of being professional and leading. And so I love that you are empowering and challenging all of us to kind of redefine leadership for ourselves, and not necessarily try to put us in a box based upon what society has said leadership should look like, feel like, taste like.
Absolutely.
And so that is really good.
And I will also say, Nika,
please.
it very much also relates to professionalism. And I don't know if you or others saw a post I did on LinkedIn recently, where I shared my beautiful new tattoo, which I'm going to show your audience here.
It is beautiful.
And, thank you. But it was this whole notion of, and it's very much related to leadership, which is, what does it mean to be professional?
Yes.
And very much, so I'm only sort of footnoting this because I think it's related to this conversation, which is, we typically in the United States have defined professionalism based on dominant culture's notion of what it means to be professional.
Right.
And how can we, what does it mean when we talk about professionalism? What behaviors are we actually talking about? Can we focus less on appearance and more so on competency, skills, and behaviors? So I think it's all very much related, but this was also just a moment for me to share my new tattoo with you.
Well, it was beautiful. I do remember seeing that post. And by the way, we are going to share your LinkedIn information to the chat for those in this community that may not be following you. I do encourage you to do so. You do produce some wonderful content. And this audience has heard me talk about the professionalism thing before, because like for a lot of Black women, how that shows up, it's like the way in which we like to wear our hair, right? For so long, and even still now, there are many leaders, individuals that do not value natural hair that's grown from Black women's heads as being professional. And so I think that, your point of there being these nuances that are unique to different, groups of people of color is important for us to make sure we're having those conversations, so that we aren't kind of lumping, people of color all together, but we are talking about these specific and unique challenges that exist. And so thank you for that. And by the way, this is coming up for me because I saw this circulating on social media this week, and I don't know if you saw it, Jaya, but I want to get your thoughts on it. But it was about AI and how.
Oh my gosh, Nika.
I know. So anyway, so for those who
Unbelievable.
haven't seen it, and I don't even know where to kind of like direct my team to try to source this. I think I saw it because someone in my network had shared it, but there was
Yep.
an Asian woman who had submitted her picture through some kind of AI tool and basically asked the tool to make her look more professional. And they gave her blue eyes. They changed her hair color. I mean, it was like they did everything to make
It's
this
shocking.
person, this Asian woman, look white. And
Mhm.
what a big disappointment. I mean, we know
Oh my
that
goodness.
AI is still challenged. We know that there's a lot that we have to be careful of, especially when we talk about intersecting DEI lens with the work of AI. While it's very powerful, there's so much to be cautious of. And that's one example that surfaced this week that to me seems to relate to this conversation of professionalism. And so I
Yep,
wanted just
absolutely.
to bring it up. Yeah. And if
No,
anybody
and that's
saw,
the next frontier, right? The
yes,
AI, G chat, like GPT, all GPT chat, all of this is the next
yes.
frontier. And it really does raise this issue of bias in AI. And it was very disturbing. I mean, I know that it's
Yes,
going in the chat, the link too. You
yes,
should all check it out. It was
yes. I think
disturbing.
my colleague was able to find that. Yeah, absolutely. So this is somewhat related, but I want you to talk a little bit more about why it is important for everyone to be included in the race conversations and not just Black and white. I'm keenly aware that oftentimes when part of the division is that when people hear diversity, equity, and inclusion, immediately they think Black and white. And I think that there's
Mhm.
a lot of merit to that in the sense of
Yep.
how the country has, the race constructs and how they came to be, right? But I'm also a believer, just like you have expressed today, that there are so many different dimensions of diversity, and there are lots of systems of oppression that are impacting so many different dimensions of diversity, including different races and ethnicities. And so, just from your vantage point, what do you think is the downfall of people automatically gravitating to Black and white instead of maybe this broader lens when race is discussed?
Mhm. No, that's a really great question. And I mean, I'll preface this by saying, I think race in the United States, I do want to be clear that when I speak about race in particular now, I'm talking about it in the US sort of
Yes.
context. But it is the third rail in this country. It's probably the most difficult subject to discuss. And I think that's probably because it begins with an individual interrogating their own racialized identity. And my impression has been that it was really only after George Floyd's murder in 2020 that people started to talk more about race in the workplace in particular.
Yeah.
So in the United States, my experience has been that it does tend to be, as you've noted, Nika, a Black and white discussion. And there's obviously, as you noted, there are reasons for that. We have a very, very painful history in this country around race and slavery and oppression. So it makes sense that the conversation has centered around the Black and white experience. And so I understand that. And the impact on me has been that, especially as I was growing up as a South Asian woman, not knowing what my role was in these conversations. And all too often I would find myself just being silent in discussions around race. And it's interesting because there are complex issues surrounding race relations for people in the Latinx community, in the Asian communities. So I think I've wondered over the years, how do we engage in this conversation in a way where all different perspectives can be shared? It's not an either or, we can have the conversation recognizing our historical context in the United States and what is the role for people of other identities, be it Latinx, be it Asian, to what is their role in these conversations? And so as an Asian woman, for example, I think about the complexity of the relationship between Asian and Black communities, where there's been this portrayal of longstanding conflict between these two groups, even where there's also been longstanding solidarity. So I think, it's just, to me, I think and going back to the model minority myth, I think that's another reason why Asians have often been left out of the conversation, because we're not seen as having a problem with race or racism.
Right.
So I think it gets quite complex, and the way it's impacted me the most is really trying to understand, probably only in the last 15 years, what is my role in the conversation, because I don't think it does anyone service for me to be silent.
Yes, absolutely. It does not. Yeah. Silence is a message too. I often talk about that. And we have to, I think that our voice is the best way for us to show up as allies, for us to make sure that we're centering the perspectives that often do not find its way into conversations where decisions are being made to impact those populations. Something that just occurred to me is that when we talk about, stereotypes and bias, and I'm putting this in the context of like the model minority, some may sit back and think, well, what are you complaining about? If there's like this notion that people believe that you are superior and you're not having to address those issues, what are you complaining about? And what you're saying is that, yes, it causes people to perceive that we aren't impacted by systems of oppression. And I want to just remind us that bias goes both ways. We can be biased for something and biased against something. And so oftentimes we just gravitate to the bias that creates the harm. But what we don't realize is that if we are so in favor of like one particular group, that we are always giving that group the opportunities, then we're leaving out a population of people that are just as deserving of being in the consideration set. And so I don't want us to just think about bias from a standpoint of having, these stereotypes or these prejudices, but also let's think about how we gravitate towards people who are like us. And that can be a challenge as well and just as harmful. So I want to talk about—
Nika, can I also add one other point, Nika? You keep making me things that are like, that are popping up in my head. One other thing for me, the other thing that has been really significant in my journey over the past 10 to 15 years has been recognizing as a South Asian woman how I am privileged and how I am marginalized. So I think each one of us has aspects of our identity that give us privilege. So for me, it's certainly my socioeconomic background, the fact that I have a law degree, the fact that higher education, I'm having a blank, but aspects of my identity that give me privilege. There are also being heterosexual, that gives me privilege. Being
absolutely
gives me pleasure, or privilege rather. And then the marginalization is about being a woman of color and other aspects. And so for me, it's been recognizing how I carry both at one time. And how can I use that privilege to support, benefit, uplift, empower those who don't have that privilege? Because I'm very mindful that, again, going back to race, when I walk into a space, I don't have the privilege of being a white woman, but I also don't have the marginalization of walking into a room as a Black woman. Yeah. And so for me, I've really had to navigate over the past 10 to 15 years, what does all of this mean to me, especially as someone doing this work?
Yeah, that is so good. And I would venture to say that probably all of us could gain value from taking inventory of just looking over our lives and identifying what sources of power and privilege we have, even if we are part of marginalized communities.
Yes.
So like you, Jaya, I love how you were sharing about yourself, because I often show up to conversations where we are talking about power and privilege and allyship and systems of oppression and equity. And I'm often, quick to say, I am a Black woman and I stand before you very privileged. I grew up in a home with both parents. I'm a, able-bodied individual. I'm a business owner. I'm educated. So I do think that's such an important exercise, because it helps us to get proximate to the ways in which we can leverage our sources of power and privilege and use it honorably to help others along the way. And that's what you brought out. And I'm so grateful that you did. I want to share with this community that we are rich in this conversation, but I am not at all going to forget that I want to give you a chance to also address your questions, your curiosities, your contributions. And so momentarily I will shift and I will invite you to do so. And if you're part of this live community here on Zoom, you can do so by using the raise hand feature to let me know that you want to share. And then I will spotlight you and invite you at the appropriate time to unmute yourself and share. Or if you desire to just place your questions into the chat, we are paying attention to that as well. And we will make sure we get to your questions as time allows. And if you're LinkedIn Live, you can place your questions into the comment section and those are going to be transferred over here. So while you're thinking about your questions or your curiosities and contributions, I want to go to the next question for Jaya. And I want you to, and it's really a two-part question. The first is, how did you find your voice in DEI? And then how does your voice in DEI, how is it shaped by this global lens that you have?
Goodness, those are great questions, Nika. So, I mean, to be 100% candid, and I'm all about just bringing my full truest self here to this
Please
space.
do.
I'm still finding my voice. I think I'm still finding my voice in this work. This part of what makes the work of DE&I so interesting is how it is. There's constant evolution. There's constant challenges. There's constant learnings. We are all individually, whether we are practitioners or not, on our own journeys
Yes.
around this work. So I am learning on a daily basis. I don't think you ever arrive. I mean, I don't hold out that I arrive at this place of mastery around DE&I work. So I think it's constantly evolving. And what I try to do at this point in my life, at this stage in my career, is just be who I am and bring that out as much as possible, because I think then we can be and live our best selves. In terms of the global lens, I mean, I think this is such an important topic, irrespective of whether you work or are in a global company that has a presence all over the world, or one that might be based in a particular region. I think it's critical that we bring a global lens to this work and to the conversation. And when I say global, I really mean global. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the term global. But the idea is that it essentially means localizing the global, or thinking globally, acting locally. So I'll toss out another resource. This term global was coined by a sociologist by the name of Roland Robertson. And Roland Robertson describes a management approach that balances the need for global strategies and practices with local adaptation. And there's a fantastic HBR article. It's called Do Your Global Teams See DEI as an American Issue? I would encourage you to check it out. But what this means for DEI work is that leaders need to address it in a way that includes narratives, discussions, and solutions that are representative of local contexts.
Yes.
There's no one size fits all approach. And so I think we can do this by understanding local issues of inequality, thinking about the words and the language we use, and how the terms may or may not resonate differently in different regions, recognizing cultural and historical differences and contexts. I remember when I was at the law firm, I was in Brussels at one point, and I remember when I was hearing more about their experience around race and DEI, someone told me, you have to remember the context within which you're in.
Yes.
And I never forget that. You really have to put yourself in the context where you are. So I think I like the term local, because I think, again, it's really about we may have global strategies or practices. There might be some common universal trends, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we also have to really localize this work so that it resonates.
You are dropping some gems, and we were able to source that article from Harvard Business Review. Do Your Global Team See DEI as an American Issue? We did place that into the chat. I also want to make sure that we give credit and place the resource of the person who coined the term global. And you did mention that. So can you just repeat that again for us, please?
It's sociologist Roland Robertson, and I believe he is referenced in that HBR article.
Okay, perfect. Awesome. So that is great. I know I'm going to go back and look at it. And you're so right. We have to think about the context of where we are, the local market, the audience that we're talking about, because it does make a tremendous difference. So I don't see any hands raised right now. So I'm going to go to my next question. So I want to talk about now the fact that you have different experiences in terms of how in which you have supported this work of DEI, higher ed, law firms. And so when you think about the various industries, do you see that there are significant differences in terms of how DEI should be manifested and executed? Or do you believe that there are just some central tenets that should find its way across the board? What are some of those differences or not that you've seen from experience?
Yeah, it's probably a both and. So I've worked as you've shared, Nika, as a DE&I practitioner, both in higher education and then in 3 different professional services firms now, a global law firm, global economic consulting firm, and then now a global executive search and leadership advisory firm. And while there are certainly differences in how the work is done, some of the key challenges and areas of focus are the same. So just as one example, in all of these environments that I've worked in, there has been a challenge or a focus around representation.
Yeah.
Whether it's in a law school or whether it's in a workplace, there's a question around, do we have strong representation from historically underrepresented groups, and how can we bolster that diversity? So that is one example of an area of focus that crosses across industry, irrespective of sort of the organization. Similarly, once we have these individuals in the institution, be it at a law school again, or at a professional services organization or some other company, how are we supporting them? How are we ensuring that they have access to the opportunities and resources they need to be successful? So when I was at the law school, that's part of what we were doing. It's that whole idea, you can bring folks in the door,
Yeah.
but if you really want them to stay and succeed and thrive and go out into the world and do great things, you need to make sure that they have the support, they have the access, that they have the community. So that's, again, similar across different industries. Third, a great example of a similarity is leadership commitment and engagement.
Yeah.
So that's another key area of focus. How do we ensure that the leadership, because we know leadership is critical for the success of this work. And when I was at the law school, that was the case. What was the senior administration's, commitment to this work? Are they engaged and committed and treating this work as a strategic priority? Similarly, in all these workplaces, that is absolutely key. The one area that's been a little different for me is, from the law school at least, in all of my professional services experiences, we are client-driven workplaces. So there's an aspect of how we work with the clients in the marketplace around DE&I, which is probably a little bit different than what I was doing in the law school. That's been a huge area of focus, as we've seen more and more clients across different types of professional services firms demand that organizations respond to this sort of rise to the call to action around DE&I. So that would be a difference, but I think there are actually quite a few similarities. Approaches are different. Just because something might have worked at one company doesn't mean I'm coming in and saying, let's do this here, right? So you really want to adapt your strategies and approach and interventions to the specific environment that you're in. But I do think there are some overarching larger areas of focus that transcend industry.
Yeah, well explained. What stood out to me was how in which you talked about when you're in the service space and you are influencing and supporting the efforts of clients that have, entrusted you with an investment of dollars to say, help us solve for XYZ, then sometimes it may be a little difficult to try to impart to those outside entities, because again, you are an influencer, you're servicing their needs, you're supporting them. This lens of DEI, especially if it's not something that's already embedded into their culture, into their value sets and their pillars of focus. And so we have experienced that as well, just within the confines of NWC and some of our clients. Some of our clients, they're just straight organizations. And so they can help determine what that manifestation of DEI looks like. But then sometimes they may be associations or membership-based organizations, and they're just there as a key resource, right, to help influence that mindset. So it is different how in which you may show up in terms of support for those organizations. So again, no hands are raised right now. I want to talk about, and I'll preface this by saying that we have been exposed to a lot of different information of late about how many companies have abandoned their DEI commitments, and how a lot of the talk during right after George Floyd's murder was seemingly performative, because there's not a whole lot of results to draw to from those commitments that were made. And then even with the economy being very uncertain, a lot of budgets have been cut, and including a lot of DEI positions and those DEI budgets. And so this question is about sustainability and that endurance factor. And so one of the things that I read in your bio was your commitment to, when you do this work, making sure that it's long lasting. So how do you ensure, Jaya, DEI gains are sustainable and long lasting, especially in consideration of some of those challenges that I just referenced?
Yes, no, and I mean, I'm sure many of you have seen, there's been mass exodus of some very high profile CIDOs at companies, and it's quite understandable and alarming that we're seeing folks leave for any number of reasons, whether it's because they're not seeing the kind of progress they would hope to see in decades of doing this work, or for other reasons. And so, and I think there are a couple key things that are required to make sure this work is sustainable and long lasting within an organization. So one, and some of this I've mentioned a little bit before, one is really making sure there is that leadership commitment. I mean, I can't underscore that enough. There really has to be that leadership commitment. One of the things that we're focused on this past year where I work is inclusive leadership, and really making sure our sort of 200 or so people leaders, starting with the top, our board, our global leadership team, have information that they can act upon related to inclusive behaviors. And we talk a lot about curiosity, courage, and empathy. And so, and we start very intentionally at senior levels with the understanding that that influences the rest of the organization. So I think that leadership commitment and inclusive leadership and being able to not only understand what that behavior is, but what can I do in my day-to-day to demonstrate those behaviors is critical. I think a second one is a strong culture of measurement and accountability. And and you've talked about this. I know you do this in your work all the time, but how do we measure and use data? Lily Zhang is another amazing thought leader who wrote an article I'm sure many people recently saw in HBR. I love HBR about how to effectively and legally use racial data for DEI. Yeah. It was fascinating. And so how are we measuring our progress? How are we holding our leaders and ourselves accountable? So I think that's really, really key. Third is, I think we're at a time and point where we need to think boldly around initiatives related to inclusion. We use these words, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I think we really need to be double downing on the I, on inclusion. I mean, we say at our company that if you have inclusion, diversity is the outcome. And so, it's really focusing on how do we take bold measures to create cultures of inclusion. So I think, and I see, Takia, the article by Lily Zhang, I'm glancing at the chats as much as I can, how to effectively and legally use racial data for DEI. But I think those three things are certainly a starting point. And also, I mean, recognizing that you can't boil the ocean. I thought when I first started out this work years ago, I'm going to do it all. You can't boil the ocean. You will, and so this gets to sort of the burnout piece and how do you keep this long-standing for yourself as a practitioner in this space. So not boiling the ocean and recognizing that there are absolutely things that can be done in the short term. There are short-term gains, but it's also not, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Right. And so I think it's both sort of how do you maintain it and make sure it's long lasting within an organization, but also if you're the one doing the work.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm so glad that article was shared. It was really, really rich. And Lily Zhang is actually a friend of our podcast. She has been on as a guest co-host. And so I'm glad this community is getting a chance to review that article. And you're right, boiling the ocean, and I think that's a really important point right now where a lot of organizations are being challenged budget-wise. I don't want to undermine the complexity of CFOs and other leaders having to deal with the shortage of financial resources and still support equally important work, right? So I don't pretend that that's not a hard chore, but I think that for those that are just putting on the chopping block, DEI, and just saying, let's do away with it, that is not the approach. Maybe let's think about where can we scale back that still leads towards meaningful impact while we weather the storm to get back to a healthier state, to be full blown into, the support work that we were putting towards DEI. And I think that's really critical. So Takia has a question that she placed into the chat that I'm going to present. How can you create space for leaders that are not extroverted? How can you help show the value in the leadership skills to get buy-in from other leaders? And so, we're just going back to like the introvert extrovert conversation, and how a lot of people have a greater affinity to extroversion styles of showing up.
I mean, thank you for that question, Tiki. I think there's a couple things that can be done. I think one, there's a real role for allies to play in creating space and conversation for individuals with differing personality styles. And I think that's both allies, but also this goes back to inclusive leadership. If you are a leader within an organization and you manage a team and you see that there are certain people who sort of take up a lot of the airtime or people who don't, what are some ways that you as a leader can sort of uplift, empower, shine a light on those who might not be as vocal? And I'm not necessarily suggesting calling them in a meeting, but perhaps checking in afterwards, perhaps making sure you give the agenda out in advance, because we know introverts oftentimes like to process and know what's about to happen. So I think part of it goes to being an inclusive leader. If you are in a leadership role and have the ability to influence that sphere of influence, or you have the ability to influence that sphere that you're in. And then also relatedly, the role of allies. So me as an introvert, I can be an ally to my fellow introverts and ambiverts. I can, make sure that I am mindful of their voice and their presence and what might be some ways that they're comfortable in vocalizing their thoughts or feelings. So I think that's certainly a piece of it. I think another thing is just having the conversation. I don't think we talk, like you were saying, Nika, I don't think we talk a lot about in the workplace about personality and personality styles. So part of it is even just creating space to acknowledge these different differences and how there are strengths in each one of them. There's no one being better than the other. They're all strengths, and they're all ways that we can sort of really support all of our colleagues coming from all these different personality types and backgrounds. We need them all in the setting, right? We need all of these differences. So I think between education and starting the conversation and allyship and inclusive leadership, those are all some ways to get started on, doing more to recognize those of us who are more of the ambivert introverts.
That is really good. And there are a number of assessments and tools that organizations leverage. I think about, Gallup Strength Finders. I think about the whole brain thinking. I think about DISC. I mean, there's so many that sometimes it gets a little complicated to try to decipher which one may be best for, a particular organization. But to your point, there are tools and assessments to help people to understand how to best interact, how to get the most out of those relationships. And I think that's really valuable because, again, that is also a part of a really important part of dimensions of diversity is how we lead, how we show up, how we like to be communicated with, how we interact. And I think that we all have to make sure we're keeping that top of mind. I love the practicality of the tools that you shared. I think sometimes even thinking about my book, Inclusion Uncomplicated, we overcomplicate this. You just said something as simple as, let's send an agenda or maybe the materials for review before the meeting. How hard is that? It's not hard at all. Again, people process differently. They may need time to kind of formulate, how do I want to show up? What do I want to ask or contribute? And they can do that if they have the information in advance. How are we leaving space for others to chime in when there are personalities that can overshadow a conversation and just be that ally to bring those voices in? So I'm big on making DEI practical because I think that's what's going to help separate those individual leaders and organizations that are effective at sustaining this work versus those that are not. We can't make this hard. Okay, so
and I would also,
and
I would also say each and every one of us has a role to play, irrespective of our title or where we sit within an organization, what role we have, who we report to. Each of us has a role to play within our own spheres of influence. We all have a sphere of influence. And I think this is so important to recognize and acknowledge that we can, be a part of the change that we want to see, no matter where we sit or what title we may hold or role we have.
So well stated. So well stated. This work belongs to all of us. And it's just a matter of finding where we best can lend support to help ensure that this work gets continued in really effective ways. So I want to kind of end with you sharing your thoughts on where would you like to see the field of DEI go in the future? And as you think about that vision, right, do you think we're headed in the right direction?
Oh, goodness.
Big question, I know.
It's such a big question. I mean, I have to hold on to hope. We
Yeah.
all know that there is a lot going on in the world, in the United States alone, you know, whether it's affirmative action, whether it's the attack on LGBTQ plus rights and everything else. There's so much going on. So it's natural to be disheartened and disappointed that at many instances, it feels like we are going back in time. I have to be hopeful, for me to do this work, and also because I have 2 young girls and we have a next generation of people coming into this world. I mean, people ask me around the whole time of the affirmative action, you know, case, people were asking me, why am I still doing this? How do I keep doing this? And I said, I have to do it because of my children and the next generation, and hope that they will have a better world to live in. In terms of the future, I mean, I really do hope we're moving in the direction where DE&I is embedded across organizations. You know, most companies now, hopefully, have a DE&I function, or when maybe it's housed within the HR or people function, but there's a DE&I role. I would love in the future, to be frank, if we were all if there was no such thing as a DEI practitioner, that we did not exist because it was so entrenched in the organization that people leaders, other leaders, it was just the part of the fabric of the organization, essentially running us, people like me and like you, Nika, out of business. I don't think that's going to happen in my lifetime, or maybe in you know, the next one for others, but really that getting to a place where it's such a part of the fabric of an institution that it is not seen as this separate other thing. It's not an afterthought. It's not put in this corner or bucket, but it's truly, we've redesigned our institutions. We know that they weren't built for everyone. We've redesigned them. We've looked at not only behaviors, but also systems and processes. So I love to hope that that is the direction we're going in. We've made quite a few strides in some areas. We have so much more to do, and it's a journey. I guess, keeping us right on time. Those are my last.
Beautiful. That is beautiful. And what a great way to end on this notion of hope. Let's do our best to try to operate from a place of strength as champions and ambassadors of this work, and not from a place of defeat. And so I love that message that you're leaving us with. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It was such a rich conversation, and I know that this audience got a lot of value from it. We will be sharing this out. If you found this to be useful, make sure that you tell your friends to catch the podcast or even the replay. And hope you all have a great and safe weekend. Thank you so much, Jaya, for being here.
Thank you, Nika. Thank you, Nika and team, and to all of you for joining this. Really appreciate it.